Okay. Let me ask you a question about metaphysics. When we emailed about what aspects of Hume's thought we might talk about, you mentioned metaphysics, and I don't really know anything about his metaphysics, although some of the things we've said are relevant, I'm sure. But so let me set up. So I'm very curious as to what you have to say his metaphysics were, but let me set it up this way. Kant, you had a very interesting conversation about Kant with David Ottlinger. Is that the way you pronounce his last name?
Yes.
So, one thing I learned in that is that there's actually some controversy over what Kant thought about a key issue. I mean, as I recall, this is what I learned from him. And the key issue is, I had always heard that Kant said, look, there is perceived reality. There's what we perceive. But beneath that, and beyond the powers of our perception, there's a deeper reality, a thing in itself, or a numinous thing, or something, and we will never know what that is. And now it turns out, again, I think there's more controversy about what his final views were on this matter.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think what I just described is the kind of Cliff Notes version, as the most common Cliff Notes version of what I would take to be his metaphysics, right? I mean, that's a metaphysical claim. Is that right?
If you interpret noumena a certain way, then that would be the metaphysics, right? I mean, the noumenal realm would be the metaphysical dimension of his philosophy.
Okay, why don't you say then what you mean by metaphysical? It's a word that, sometimes people use it dismissively to refer to just like woo stuff, like Shirley MacLaine is getting all metaphysical. But there is a rigorous, there is a serious philosophical concept of metaphysics. Yeah. What's the thumbnail definition of what we mean by metaphysics?
This is actually really quite difficult to do. I mean,
right.
Traditionally, the word metaphysics refers to the most basic fundamental structure of reality, right? So for someone like Aristotle, the book, The Metaphysics, is devoted to understanding what the fundamental substance is. And the answer that he gives actually in the Metaphysics is interesting because it changes his mind from what he says in his earlier works. In his earlier works, he says that particular things are the most basic fundamental things in the world. And then in the Metaphysics, specifically in Book Zeta, he changes his mind and says, no, actually, Plato was right all along, and form is the most basic substance. Although he has a very different view of form than Plato does, Plato thinks forms are transcendent and exist in a separate reality.
There's this ideal version of a chair out there.
Aristotle thinks of form as sort of the structure of things, right? The ways, the form would be the form is immanent in things rather than transcendent. So traditionally, the idea of metaphysics is that it's the study of the most basic fundamental aspects of reality. But that definition is sort of hard to sustain once you get to the scientific revolution, because certainly it would seem, at least, that fundamental physics is the most basic study of the nature of reality. And I do think that metaphysics takes on a slightly different conception, and I think we can maybe actually tie Hume, Kant, and the logical positivists together in telling this little story.
The logical positives being people who came later,
came in the 20th century,
and basically insisted that the only valid kind of knowledge is science in a certain sense, right? It's claims that can be tested empirically is the only kind of claim worth even talking about.
The logical positivists are essentially 20th century Humeans who rejected the entire continental tradition that took off after Kant, right? And I'll say something about that. I don't have to say very much to sort of situate them. So if you remember, I talked about relations of ideas and matters of fact. These exhaust the kind of knowledge we can have, according to Hume. So we can either have knowledge of essentially logical truths, or we can have knowledge that's grounded in experience. Now Kant comes along and says, don't know about that. First of all, Kant says, the truths of arithmetic are not relations of ideas. 7 plus 5 equals 12 is not analytic. Okay? And secondly, Kant is not willing to give up the notions that Hume is willing to naturalize away. Notions like causality, or notions like extendedness, right? Or distinct existence, separateness from us, right? Kant's not willing to naturalize those away. He thinks that those are fundamental and need to be somehow demonstrated. However, he agrees that they're not matters of fact and they're not relations of ideas. And so Kant introduces a third category of knowledge, which he calls the synthetic a priori. So this is knowledge that is not based in experience, it's independent of experience, but it's not tautological, it's substantial, right? Now that seems to bring metaphysics back, because if there is knowledge that doesn't come from experience but is substantial, that means that there must be a sort of level of reality that's knowable in this way.
So are these are like the notions of space and time?
Right, space, time, causality.
And causality is one.
Yes.
Okay, so those are a priori in the sense that they don't come from experience. They are prerequisites for having coherent experience.
That's right. And that's what Kant calls what's called a transcendental argument.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be causality. There has to be these things, because otherwise the experience that we have would not be possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, I think, by the way, I think evolutionary psychology, just in the most casual sense, bears them out, which is that, look, we evolved, our brains evolved to deal with the world. I mean, I think anybody who studied the brain would say, yeah, they are set up to assimilate things in terms of space and time, and probably to presuppose something like causality.
Right. So, although Kant, of course, would not give any sort of evolutionary and naturalistic
No, all
account,
these guys came before Darwin.
but he gives us sort of what I said, it was a transcendental account, sort of an account in terms of how the ways in which they're necessary for the possibility of the experience we have. So that then opens up the room for metaphysics again, right? Metaphysics consists of synthetic a priori knowledge, right? Now, of course, the problem is, yeah, but how do you get it, right? That led 19th century philosophers, a lot of them, into all sorts of very speculative, hard to read. I mean, this is where you get all of your really tough early continental philosophy. And you get to the 20th century, and it was the logical positivists who said, no, we need to go back to Hume. But they did it even tougher than Hume. They didn't just say that matters of fact and relations of ideas are the only knowledge we can have. They said these are the only kinds of meaningful statements there are, right? So in other words, it's not just a criterion of justification. It's a linguistic criterion. Mm-hmm. And so any statement that's not empirically verifiable or a logical truth is literally meaningless, like as if you and I just started making noises, okay? Mm-hmm. So they thereby, the positivists, in one swoop, dispense of all metaphysics, all ethics, all normative value judgment type statements wind up being, strictly speaking, meaningless on this view. That's why you could have a book like A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth, and Logic, which is sort of the manifesto of logical positivism. The book is like this big. Because there's so little, right? Yeah. There's so little that, And
it will be the last philosophical book, right? Because from there on out, it's just science.
That's right. Wittgenstein famously in the Tractatus, when he was still, at least according to some people, in that mood, said everything that cannot be stated in this way literally cannot be said.
Well, right, but that's the utterance that is kind of famously ambiguous, right? And the logical positivist seized on it as meaning what they meant, whereas Wittgenstein ultimately, at least, meant it more in the way a mystic would mean it. There's no point in talking about certain things, but that doesn't mean they're not true.
I think that's right. I think the logical positivist clearly misunderstood him. Wittgenstein himself said that they misunderstood him. Wittgenstein famously rejected the introduction that Russell wrote for the Tractatus because Russell misunderstood him. So I'm agreeing with that entirely. I'm simply sort of trying to situate this arc, right? So metaphysics falls on hard times again once the positivists come along. The interesting thing is that, at least in the analytic tradition, because, what I just described was, after Kant, there's a split. There's what's called the Continental Philosophers, who take up the metaphysical side of Kant, if that's a correct reading of him. I personally don't think it is. But they take up the metaphysical side of Kant. The empiricists don't. People like John Stuart Mill stay empiricists through the 19th century. The 20th century, this split continues, so where you have basically two tracks. You have analytic philosophers who are basically Humeans, and Continental philosophers who are largely Neo-Kantians, right? It isn't until the publication of Saul Kripke's book Naming and Necessity in the 1978 or 9, that metaphysics gets back into analytic philosophy again. And maybe in another dialogue we could talk about Kripke, because he's awfully interesting. He's very important. And he is the way that metaphysics got back into analytic philosophy. But it was basically gone.
Now we haven't actually defined analytic philosophy, and it may be a little... I'm defining it now as the people who stuck with Hume and rejected the metaphysical reading of Kant. That's how I'm going to characterize them, so that we don't go off into a long... Okay, but it may be a little confusing for people, because we distinguish between analytic truths and synthetic truths, and I guess this is related, but it's not the same, right? I don't
know why they're called analytic philosophers. I think it's partly because they thought that the primary job of philosophy was logical analysis.
And analysis of the meaning of utterances, right? Analysis of language. I remember at the end of A History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell, in doing a little advertisement, I think, for analytic philosophy, says, now there are some of us who, true, we don't make the grand claims that Hegel and all these guys I just talked about made, but we think, we're focusing on smaller questions about the meaning of things, but we think that what we do think we know, we really know. They're smaller issues, but we think we can really get a grip on them. So I guess, so you're saying that is somewhat in the tradition of Hume's empiricism, in the sense of eschewing things that are hard to talk about. It's like focus on things you can really talk about, get clear on what you mean by the language, and test them by the evidence.
And the only people who are in the business of substantive knowledge are scientists. Okay?
Right. This according to logical positivism, and pretty much according to the analytic school, you're saying?
Yes. Uh-huh. The only people in the business of substantive knowledge are scientists. What philosophers do is they do what's called conceptual analysis, and so they use the tools of logic and linguistics to analyze concepts and statements for the purposes of clarification, right? Mm-hmm. So a philosopher, scientists go out and confirm hypotheses, but a philosopher might clarify what one means by confirm, right? And so half the philosophy of science is about what do you mean, what does confirm mean? What do we mean by confirm? What is it to confirm a hypothesis, right? So they're not really in the business of substantive knowledge. Philosophy is in the business of linguistic and conceptual housekeeping, so to speak.
Right.
And the Continental tradition doesn't accept this at all. The Continental tradition has always thought that philosophy is also in the business of substantive knowledge, but that's because they come out of the idealistic tradition after Kant that takes Kant as being metaphysically inflationary rather than as metaphysically very limiting, which is how I see it.
You're saying the Continental, and first we should say, okay, so we had this dichotomy at the beginning. Empiricism, the empiricist versus the rationalist. Right. Now, if people were paying attention, they may have noticed the empiricists were either British, Irish, or English, Irish, or Scottish. That's why it's called British empiricism. The rationalists were all living on the continent, the ones I think you named.
And I don't think that's an accident.
Right, and
I think these philosophies do respect certain national temperaments and other deep things that I think are actually very interesting. But yes, you're absolutely right. There is something very British about the analytic tradition, and it's not until the 20th century that you have an offshoot of it in Europe. That's the Vienna Circle, right? So they're the logical positivists. There you start having empiricist-minded philosophers in Germany and Austria, but for the most part, it's a very Anglo-Saxon tradition, right?
Okay. So to get back to Hume's metaphysics,
So I think Hume doesn't think there is any metaphysics, right? Because
that's what I was going to suspect, is that he wouldn't. Although, I mean, on the one hand, I would think he would be sympathetic to that Kantian claim I characterized, like, all we know is surface reality. Hume's on board so far, right? All we know is that we have the perceptual experiences we have. We don't know what lies beneath them. But Kant seems more confident that something lies beneath them. There's a more fundamental reality, and Hume is just agnostic.
Yeah, but I'm almost wondering, that depends on the specific reading of Kant. I mean, that assumes that you take the noumena as a sort of a separate world, as opposed to the way I think the noumena should be taken. And Ottlinger, in our dialogue, said there's two ways you can look at the noumena.
Right.
The noumena aren't a separate set of things. They're simply the phenomena when one imagines them not from any perspective. In other words, in other words,
right.
The
view from nowhere.
Right. The noumena is what results when you artificially take the view from nowhere, which you can't really do. Right. That's why, in a sense, the noumena are unknowable. It's not because they lie in some far reaches of the world that you can never reach, like Plato's forms. Rather, it's simply a matter of, when we think of reality from no perspective, right? Then what you're left with is a noumenon, right? And that's not an object of knowledge. An object of knowledge is that which is understood from a perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Through the categories of the understanding, right, and the categories of the sensibility. And so, I don't take Kant idealistically, and none of the analytic philosophers do. So the way you're taught Kant even will be very different in an analytic program.
Well, this is what I was saying. I learned from listening to your conversation with David Ottlinger is the view I presented of Kant is I think fairly commonly presented one. I'm not sure, but it's the one I had going into that. Now I realize there's a dispute over how you should take Kant's metaphysics. But in any event, I would think that Hume, I would have suspected what you said, which is that Hume basically doesn't have a metaphysics because he, less ambiguously than Kant, just wants to stop at the surface appearance. All we know is there's a surface appearance. Who knows what could be underneath it? Computer code could be underneath it if we're in the simulation, but we just don't know, and that's all you can say.
Well, he doesn't stop at the surface appearances. He does give psychological accounts of the reasons for our believing beyond the appearances. In other words, he does want to account for why we believe beyond the appearances. Yeah. He just doesn't think that can be a rational story. That's going to be essentially a mechanistic story.
Right.
It's going to be a story about how the human mind works.
Right.
And his is basically a crudely associationist psychology, right? So we connect things together that look the same, or that happen close to each other, or that happen one after the other in time, and then that causes us, in a sense, to make judgments beyond what the evidence, strictly speaking, can justify, right? And so it's not that he doesn't want to go beyond the appearances. It's just that he doesn't think that beyond what is experienced, anything else can be said about the world. At that point, all that we can do is say things about ourselves, right? And how we perceive the world. I actually think in a lot of ways, Hume and Kant aren't necessarily that far apart. But it's more a matter of emphasis and a matter of
See, one reason I had always thought that Kant's metaphysics, as I described it, was a reflection of his, at some level, wanting to be religious, much more than Hume seems to want to be religious.
Hume doesn't want to be religious.
Right. And that's why but I don't know where I got that idea that Kant, well, certainly it's the case, I'm sure, that
Kant comes from a pietist family. Mm-hmm. So he comes from a pretty rigorously Protestant background, and there have been a lot of books written lately about Kant's pietism, precisely because people are now starting to wonder how much of his philosophy there's a lot of stuff in the ethics, in Kant's ethics, that sounds to me a lot like St. Paul.